The M38A1 military jeep sat in the corner of the Veterans Memorial parking lot like a monument to failure. Engine seized, transmission destroyed, frame rusted through in places that made grown men wince. Sarah Brennan stood 3 feet away from it, her work boots planted in gravel that hadn't been swept in months. Her hands still black with grease from the Chevy pickup she'd just finished underneath her father's garage. The August heat in Marion, Indiana, pressed down on everything, turning the asphalt soft and making the air shimmer above the old military vehicle. "Start this war vehicle and I'll respect you," Captain Morris said, his arms crossed over a chest full of service ribbons Sarah couldn't name. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes had that particular shine men get when they think they've cornered you into proving something you can't prove. 3 other veterans stood behind him, their faces weathered by sun and decades, their expressions ranging from amused to skeptical. The youngest of them couldn't have been more than 60, shifted his weight and looked away when Sarah's eyes passed over him. She didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that much, at least, from her father before the Parkinson's had taken his ability to grip a wrench, before the tremors had stolen his livelihood, one small muscle at a time. Tom Brennan had taught her that silence was sometimes the best negotiation tactic a mechanic could deploy. Let them talk themselves into corners. Let them reveal what they really wanted. "It hasn't run in 17 years, Morris continued, his voice carrying that particular authority that came from having ordered younger men into situations where some of them didn't come back. "Every mechanic in Grant County has looked at it. Jimmy Pearson down at Pearson's Auto said the block was cracked. Dave Whitmore at the Chevy dealer said the whole thing should be scrapped for parts. You're what, 28, 29? 32, Sarah said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, so she cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm 32. 32, Morris repeated, like he was filing the information away for later use. "And you think you can succeed where men with 40 years of experience have failed?" It wasn't a question, so Sarah didn't treat it like one. She walked toward the jeep instead, her boots crunching on gravel, her eyes taking in details the way her father had taught her, the way the front axle sat at an angle that suggested a broken mounting bracket, the dark stain on the ground beneath the oil pan that meant more than a simple leak, the spiderweb of cracks across the windshield that nobody had bothered to replace, because why bother when the engine was dead anyway? She crouched beside the driver's side front tire. The rubber had rotted through in places, showing the canvas underneath. The hubcap was missing. Someone had spray-painted Korea 1952 on the hood in white letters that had faded to the color of old bone. "My father served," Sarah said, running her hand along the frame rail. "Not Korea, Vietnam. He came back and opened Brennan's Auto Repair in 1978, died last March." She stood up, wiping her palms on her jeans, even though the grease wouldn't come off without industrial soap and a wire brush. "He taught me that every machine tells you what's wrong with it if you know how to listen." Morris's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. The other veterans had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that meant they were actually paying attention now instead of waiting for their turn to talk. "The VFW raised $12,000 to restore this vehicle," Morris said. "It was supposed to be the centerpiece of the Memorial Day parade. That was 3 years ago. The money's gone. Paid to mechanics who took our deposit and then told us it couldn't be done. We've got $460 left. That's what we can pay. Take it or leave it." $460 wouldn't cover parts, and they both knew it. The silence stretched out between them, filled with the distant sound of traffic on State Road 9 and the mechanical whine of the air conditioning unit on the VFW building struggling against the heat. Sarah looked at the Jeep again, really looked at it this time, not as a challenge or a test, but as what it actually was, a piece of history that men like her father had relied on to stay alive, to carry wounded soldiers to field hospitals, to navigate terrain that would destroy civilian vehicles. She thought about her father's hands, how steady they'd been when she was young, how she'd watched them shake uncontrollably as he'd tried to drink coffee in those final months. "I'll need to see the work orders from the other mechanics," she said, "and I'll need access to the VFW workshop. I can't move this to my garage. It's too far gone for that." Morris unfolded his arms. "So you're saying yes?" "I'm saying I'll try," Sarah corrected. "That's all anyone can promise with something this destroyed. If the block is cracked like Pearson said, I can't fix that without a replacement engine. And finding a period-correct M38A1 engine isn't something you can do with $460 and a prayer." "But you'll try." Sarah nodded once. The motion felt like stepping off a cliff, like that moment after you commit to something stupid and right before you realize just how stupid it actually was. "I'll try." Captain Morris extended his hand. Sarah shook it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the firmness of his grip that was somehow also respectful, not trying to prove anything, just acknowledging an agreement between equals. "You've got until Veterans Day," he said. "November 11th. That's 14 weeks. We want to unveil it at the ceremony. 14 weeks to resurrect a vehicle that had defeated every other mechanic in the county. 14 weeks to prove that a woman who'd inherited her father's garage but not his reputation could do what men with decades of experience had declared impossible." Sarah walked back to her truck, climbing into the cab that still smelled like her father's cigarettes even though he'd quit smoking 20 years ago. The steering wheel was hot enough to burn, but she gripped it anyway, letting the pain ground her, letting it remind her that she'd just promised something she might not be able to deliver. The drive back to Brennan's auto repair took 7 minutes. She knew because she counted every second, her mind already working through the problem, already seeing the Jeep in pieces, already mapping the path from wreckage to restoration. Her mother's car was parked in front of the garage when she arrived, a 2015 Honda Civic that Sarah had begged her to trade in for something newer, something safer, something that didn't have 180,000 miles, and a transmission that was 3,000 miles past its recommended service interval. Linda Brennan stood in the doorway of the garage office, her hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn for as long as Sarah could remember, her face lined in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with watching the man she loved deteriorate one neuron at a time. "Where were you?" Linda asked. "Mrs. Patterson called about her Buick, said you were supposed to have it ready by 3. Sarah checked her phone. It was 3:47. "I'll call her. The alternator took longer than I expected." "You can't keep doing this," Linda said, and there was something in her voice that made Sarah stop halfway through the doorway. "You can't keep taking on jobs that don't pay and letting the ones that do pile up behind them. It's the VFW Jeep," Sarah said. "They asked me to restore it." Linda's expression shifted, surprise first, then something that looked almost like fear. "Sarah, no. That thing has destroyed 3 shops' reputations. Everyone in town knows it can't be fixed." "Then I'll prove them wrong. Or you'll prove them right, and you'll lose what little credibility you have left." Linda stepped forward, her hands pressed together like she was praying, except Sarah's mother hadn't prayed since the diagnosis, hadn't set foot in a church since the funeral. "Your father spent 37 years building this business. The only reason we still have customers is because people remember him. But that memory won't last forever, and every time you miss a deadline, every time you prioritize some impossible project over paying work, you chip away at what he built." The words landed like punches, each one precise, each one true. Sarah had missed deadlines. She had prioritized projects that made her feel something over projects that made financial sense. She had watched their customer base shrink from 24 regulars to maybe 10, had seen the way people's eyes shifted when she quoted them a price, comparing it to what her father would have charged, wondering if his daughter really knew what she was doing. "I have to do this," Sarah said, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how uncertain. "I have to prove that I can." "To who?" Linda asked. "To Captain Morris, to the town, to your father's ghost." She shook her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler but no less cutting. "He's gone, Sarah. Tom is gone. And you standing in this garage trying to resurrect vehicles that should stay dead won't bring him back." Sarah didn't have an answer for that. She walked past her mother into the office, pulling up Mrs. Patterson's number on her phone, preparing to apologize for a delay she couldn't really explain, without sounding exactly like what her mother had just accused her of being, someone who prioritized sentiment over business sense. Someone who was slowly destroying the legacy she was supposed to be protecting. The phone rang 4 times before Mrs. Patterson answered. Sarah could hear her grandchildren in the background, their voices high and excited, the sound of a family that worked in ways Sarah's never had. "Mrs. Patterson, it's Sarah Brennan. I'm so sorry about your Buick. There was a complication with the alternator. I'll have it ready first thing tomorrow morning, and I'm not going to charge you for the labor, just parts." There was a pause, then, "That's very kind of you, dear. But you don't need to do that. Your time is worth something." "I know," Sarah said, "but so is keeping my word. Tomorrow morning, I promise." She hung up before Mrs. Patterson could argue, before she could be kind in that way that made Sarah feel even worse about her failures. Through the office window, she could see her mother getting back into the Honda, could see the way she gripped the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine, and Sarah knew that grip, knew it was the same thing she'd done in her truck earlier, holding on to something solid while everything else felt like it was falling apart. The Buick would take 3 hours tonight, maybe 4 if she ran into more complications. Then she'd need to start on the Jeep assessment, cataloguing every broken component, every rusted bolt, every impossible challenge. 14 weeks until Veterans Day, 14 weeks to prove her mother wrong, 14 weeks to prove herself right. She pulled on her work gloves and headed toward the Buick, already running numbers in her head. $460 for parts, her own labor for free, borrowed tools from shops that still remembered her father fondly enough to help his daughter, called in favors from parts suppliers who owed Tom Brennan something even after death. The first bolt came loose with a satisfying crack. Sarah set it aside and reached for the next one, her hands moving with the certainty that only came from repetition, from muscle memory built over thousands of hours in this same garage, standing in the same oil-stained patch of concrete where her father had stood, using tools that had shaped his hands before they shaped hers. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the evening train rolling through Marion, its whistle cutting through the summer heat, marking the passage of time, the way it had for over a century. The work stretched ahead of her, endless, impossible, necessary. She reached for another bolt and kept going. The VFW workshop smelled like old concrete, and decades of cigarette smoke trapped in acoustic ceiling tiles. Sarah stood in the middle of it at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, her notebook open to a page already half filled with observations, her coffee going cold in a travel mug balanced on top of a filing cabinet marked Career Personnel. The M38A1 sat on jack stands in the center of the room, looking worse in the fluorescent lighting than it had in the August sun. Someone had already started stripping parts before giving up. The hood was propped against the wall, the seats were missing entirely, and the steering wheel hung at an angle that suggested the steering column had been damaged in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the outside. Sarah had been here since 5:30, working by the light from her phone until Captain Morris arrived to unlock the building and turn on the power. He'd handed her a key without comment, nodded once, and left her alone with her impossible task. She'd found the work orders from the previous mechanics stuffed in a cardboard box, marked Restoration Project, Deceased. The word choice bothered her more than it should have. Deceased implied something that had once been alive. This Jeep had rolled off an assembly line in Toledo, Ohio in 1952, 71 years ago. It had served in Korea during the final year of the war. It had transported wounded soldiers from aid stations to field hospitals. It had carried ammunition, officers' maps, medical supplies. It had done its job until it couldn't anymore. And then it had been decommissioned, sold as surplus, passed through half a dozen civilian owners, and eventually donated to the Marion VFW in 1998. The work orders told a story of progressive failure. Jimmy Pearson's assessment from 2021, engine block cracked beyond repair, recommend replacement, parts availability, poor, cost estimate $8, $500. Dave Whitmore's note from 2022, confirmed cracked block. Also identified frame damage, rotted floor panels, destroyed wiring harness, seized transmission. Not economically feasible to restore. Recommends salvage. A third assessment, this one from a restoration specialist in Indianapolis, dated just 4 months ago. Vehicle requires complete disassembly and rebuild. Frame must be replaced or extensively repaired. All mechanical systems are non-functional. Conservative estimate for full restoration, $28,000, $35,000, not including period-correct parts acquisition. Sarah set the work orders aside and picked up her inspection mirror, crouching beside the engine block to examine the crack Jimmy Pearson had identified. She could see it, a hairline fracture running from the second cylinder down toward the oil pan, barely visible unless you knew where to look and had light at exactly the right angle. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Did you remember to call the parts supplier about the Henderson's transmission?" Sarah hadn't remembered. She'd been so focused on the Jeep that she'd forgotten about the bread-and-butter work that actually kept the lights on, the work that paid bills and maintained the reputation her mother was so worried about protecting. She texted back, "Calling them now." But she didn't call. She stared at the cracked engine block instead, running scenarios in her mind, calculating possibilities. A traditional repair was impossible. You couldn't weld a cast-iron block in a location like this and expect it to hold under the stress of normal operation. But there were other options, unconventional options. Her father had shown her one years ago on a tractor engine that everyone else had written off. The memory came back sharp and clear. She must have been 16, wearing coveralls that were too big for her, watching her father carefully drill and tap holes on either side of a crack in a Ferguson tractor's engine block. He'd used a technique called cold stitching, inserting interlocking metal pins to bridge the crack, sealing it with specialized epoxy designed for high heat applications. "Most mechanics won't do this," he'd told her, his hands steady as he worked, not even a hint of the tremor that would come years later. "They'll tell you it can't be done, that it's not reliable, that you're wasting your time, and maybe they're right. But sometimes the difference between possible and impossible is just being willing to try something that might fail." The tractor had run for another 8 years before the farmer finally replaced it. Sarah straightened up, her knees protesting the movement. She was 32, but she felt older on mornings like this. Mornings where she'd slept badly because her mind wouldn't stop working through problems. Mornings where her first coffee had gone cold before she'd taken 3 sips. The workshop door opened. Captain Morris entered, followed by 2 other veterans Sarah recognized from the parking lot, the younger one who'd looked away, and an older man with a Korean War Veterans Association cap and a cane that looked more like a statement than a necessity. "Making progress?" Morris asked. Sarah showed him the work orders. "These assessments are accurate. The engine block is cracked. The frame has structural damage in at least 3 places. The wiring harness is completely destroyed. The transmission is seized, probably from sitting with old fluid for too many years. So you're giving up?" It wasn't a question. Morris said it like a fact he'd been expecting to hear all along. "I'm telling you what's wrong with it," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference between diagnosis and prognosis." The older veteran with the cane stepped forward. "You talk like a doctor." "My father used to say that mechanics and doctors aren't that different," Sarah said. "Both of us are trying to fix things that are broken. Both of us have to know when the patient can be saved and when it can't." "And this patient?" the older veteran asked. His name tag read Walter Chen, Korea 1951-1953. Sarah looked at the Jeep again, seeing it not as it was but as it could be. Engine running smooth, transmission shifting clean, frame reinforced and repainted, seats recovered, windshield replaced, every bolt and bracket and bearing brought back to functional life. "This patient can be saved, Yue," she said, "but not with traditional methods. Every mechanic who looked at this approached it the same way, like a standard restoration job where you replace parts until everything works again. But you can't find parts for a 1952 M38A1 easily. The ones that exist are expensive, and with your budget," she gestured at the work orders, "you can't afford a traditional restoration." "So what are you proposing?" Morris asked. "Field repair techniques," Sarah said. "The kind of things Army mechanics would have done in Korea when they couldn't get replacement parts and couldn't afford to have a vehicle down for weeks. Cold stitching for the engine block, frame welding and reinforcement instead of replacement, rebuilding the transmission instead of replacing it. Manufacturing custom parts where we can't source originals." "Oh," the three veterans exchanged glances. Walter Chen leaned on his cane and studied Sarah with eyes that had seen things she could only imagine from history books and her father's careful silence about certain subjects. "Field repairs don't last," Chen said. "They're meant to get you through the immediate crisis, not for long-term operation." "Nduk, field repairs don't last when they're done quickly under combat conditions," Sarah agreed. "But when they're done carefully, with proper materials and time, they can outlast factory specifications. My father kept a Ferguson tractor running for 8 years on a cold-stitched engine block." "A tractor isn't a military vehicle," Morris said. "No," Sarah agreed. "A tractor works harder. More hours under load, more stress on the engine, less maintenance than military vehicles receive. If the repair holds on a tractor, it'll hold on this." The younger veteran, his name tag read David Sullivan, Iraq 2004-2005, spoke for the first time. "Why are you really doing this?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd expected skepticism about her technical approach, about her ability to execute, about whether the repairs would hold. She hadn't expected anyone to question her motivation. "I told you," she said. "My father served. That's not an answer," Sullivan interrupted. "That's a deflection. Half the mechanics in Grant County have fathers or grandfathers who served. That doesn't explain why you're willing to take on a project that has bankrupted other shops for $460 and no guarantee of success." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She could have lied, could have given them the answer they probably wanted to hear, something about patriotism or respecting veterans or honoring military history. But Sullivan's eyes were too steady, too knowing. He'd been to Iraq. He'd come back. He could probably smell bullshit from a mile away. "Because I need to prove I can do it," Sarah said. The honesty felt dangerous, like admitting weakness in front of people who would use it against her. "Every customer who comes into my garage, they're comparing me to my father. Every time I quote a price or diagnose a problem or estimate a timeline, they're thinking, Tom would have done it faster, or Tom would have charged less, or Tom would have known the answer without having to look it up." She took a breath. The workshop was very quiet. Even the traffic noise from outside seemed to have faded. "My father built Brennan's auto repair from nothing," she continued. He was the best mechanic in Marion, maybe the best in Grant County. When he got sick, when the Parkinson's started, he taught me everything he could before the tremors got too bad for him to work. But teaching someone and having them actually measure up to your standard are two different things. So when Captain Morris offered me this job, when he made it clear he didn't think I could do it, I saw a chance to prove that I'm not just Tom Brennan's daughter trying to coast on his reputation. I'm a mechanic who can succeed where other mechanics failed. The silence stretched out. Walter Chen was nodding slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. Sullivan's expression hadn't changed. Morris had his arms crossed again, that same posture from the parking lot. But his eyes looked different somehow, less skeptical, more assessing. $460, Morris said finally. That's still all we can pay. I know. And you'll have it running by Veterans Day. I'll have it running by Veterans Day, Sarah confirmed, and the words felt like a contract signed in blood, irrevocable and binding. Morris nodded once. Then we won't waste any more of your time. Come on, gentlemen. They filed out of the workshop, Sullivan last. He paused at the door and looked back at Sarah. My grandfather served in Korea, he said. He drove one of these. Brought wounded guys back from the front lines, saved a lot of lives. He died before I deployed to Iraq. Sullivan touched the doorframe, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. When I got back, when I was dealing with everything that comes after, I used to think about him, about how he'd done his job and come home and built a normal life. It helped sometimes, knowing it was possible. Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. That Jeep meant something to him, Sullivan said. It means something to a lot of guys like him. So when you fix it, you're not just proving you can do the job. You're preserving something that can't be replaced. Don't fuck it up. He left before Sarah could respond. The door swung shut behind him, and she was alone again with the Jeep and her notebook and her cold coffee and the slowly growing certainty that she'd committed to something that was about much more than her own need for validation. She picked up her phone and finally called the parts supplier about the Henderson's transmission, made the arrangements, placed the order, scheduled the delivery. Then she called Mrs. Patterson to confirm her Buick was ready for pickup. Then she responded to 3 emails from customers asking about various jobs, giving them timelines she hoped she could meet. By the time she finished the administrative work that actually kept her business running, it was almost 8:00 a.m. Sarah pulled the hood off the Jeep's engine, setting it aside carefully, and began the real work of disassembly, documenting every component, every connection, every detail that would matter when it came time to put everything back together. Her father had taught her to take photos of everything during disassembly. Your memory is good, he'd said, but it's not perfect. And 6 weeks from now, when you're trying to remember which bolt went in which hole, you'll be grateful for the photos. Sarah took 47 photos that first morning. She filled 6 pages in her notebook with measurements, observations, and questions that would need answers. She identified 3 additional problems the other mechanics hadn't mentioned: a cracked motor mount, a stripped bolt on the oil pan, and evidence of previous amateur repair work that had actually made things worse. By noon, she was covered in rust and old grease. Her hands were cramping, and she'd made exactly 1 hour's worth of progress on a project that needed hundreds of hours. She thought about her mother's warning, "You'll lose what little credibility you have left." She thought about Sullivan's words, "Don't fuck it up." She thought about her father's hands, the way they'd moved with absolute certainty across engine blocks and transmissions and differentials, never hesitating, always knowing exactly what needed to be done. Her own hands shook slightly as she reached for the next bolt, not from Parkinson's, just from exhaustion and low blood sugar and the weight of carrying a legacy she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. But she reached for the bolt anyway, and she kept working. 3 weeks into the restoration, Sarah stopped sleeping properly. It started small, waking up at 3 a.m. with her mind racing through technical problems, unable to fall back asleep until dawn. Then dragging herself to the garage on 4 hours of rest. Then it progressed to lying awake for hours, mentally inventorying parts, calculating costs, rehearsing conversations with suppliers who were increasingly reluctant to extend credit to a shop that paid late more often than it paid on time. By week 5, she was running on caffeine and stubbornness, taking catnaps in her truck between jobs, forgetting to eat until her hands started shaking from low blood sugar rather than exhaustion. The Henderson transmission job had gone badly. She'd underestimated the damage, had to order additional parts, blown past her quoted timeline by 6 days. Mr. Henderson had been understanding, too understanding. In that way, that meant he pitied her rather than respected her. He'd paid the invoice without complaint and mentioned almost casually that his nephew had opened a shop over in Fairmount, was doing good work, real competitive prices. Sarah had lost 3 customers that month. 1 to the nephew in Fairmount. 2 to a new, quick lane that had opened in Marion with certified technicians and a corporate warranty structure that a small, independent shop couldn't match. Her mother had stopped asking about the Jeep. That silence was somehow worse than the criticism. The Jeep itself was spread across the VFW workshop in a state of controlled chaos that only Sarah understood. The engine block was out, sitting on a reinforced workbench she'd built from scrap lumber and steel brackets. She'd spent 47 hours cold stitching the crack, drilling and tapping holes for interlocking pins every quarter-inch along the fracture, sealing each joint with high-temperature epoxy that cost $38 per tube and required 12 tubes to complete the repair. The frame was a bigger problem. The damage was more extensive than the initial assessments had suggested. What should have been simple welding and reinforcement turned into a complete frame restoration that required techniques Sarah had only read about, never performed. She'd called every restoration specialist she could find. Most didn't return her calls. The ones who did quoted prices that started at $5,000 and went up from there. On a Tuesday night in late September, Sarah sat on the workshop floor at 11:30 p.m., her back against the wall, looking at the disassembled Jeep with the growing certainty that she'd failed before she'd really begun. The cold stitching had worked. She'd pressure-tested the engine block that afternoon and found no leaks, no weaknesses. But the frame repair was beyond her capability. She could weld, she could reinforce. But properly restoring a frame with this much damage required tools she didn't have, expertise she hadn't developed, and time she couldn't afford. Her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed a number from Indianapolis she didn't recognize. "Is this Sarah Brennan?" The voice was male, older, with a slight southern accent. "Speaking. My name is Robert Freeman. I'm a restoration specialist. Captain Morris called me about a Jeep you're working on." Sarah sat up straighter. "Mr. Freeman, yes, I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. I know. I've been watching your progress." The words landed strange. "Watching my progress?" "Morris has been sending me photos," Freeman explained. "The cold stitching work on the block, your documentation process, the way you've organized the disassembly. It's good work, better than good, actually. Most mechanics your age don't have the patience for that kind of detailed repair." "Thank you," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure where this was going. "The frame, though," Freeman continued, "that's giving you trouble." It wasn't a question. Sarah looked at the frame pieces laid out on the floor, twisted metal and rust and impossible challenges. "Yes," she admitted, "I can't do it with my current setup. I've tried, but I don't have the equipment or the expertise for structural frame repair at this level." "I know," Freeman said. "That's why I'm calling. I'm driving up to Marion tomorrow. I'll be there around 10 a.m. Can you meet me at the VFW? Sarah's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. "Mr. Freeman, I can't pay you. The budget for this job is $460, and I've already spent $312 of that on parts and materials. I'm not asking for payment, Freeman said. I'm offering to teach you. 1 week. I'll show you how to repair the frame properly. We'll do it together, and then I'll go back to Indianapolis and you can finish the rest of the job on your own. Why would you do that? There was a pause. Sarah could hear music in the background, something classical she didn't recognize. Because 30 years ago, when I was 26 and trying to start my own restoration business, a man named Tom Brennan drove 3 hours to my shop and spent a weekend teaching me diagnostic techniques I couldn't have learned anywhere else, Freeman said. He didn't charge me, didn't ask for anything in return. Just said that good mechanics should help each other and that keeping old skills alive was worth more than money. Sarah's throat tightened. She'd known her father helped other mechanics, but he'd never mentioned this, never told stories about teaching people he'd never meet again. I didn't know that, she said quietly. He wouldn't have told you, Freeman replied. Tom wasn't the kind of man who needed recognition for doing the right thing. But I owed him a debt, and I couldn't pay it before he died. So I'll pay it to his daughter instead, if you're willing to learn. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that she was getting grease on her face. I'm willing to learn. Then I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Get some sleep, Sarah. You're going to need it. He hung up before she could say thank you, before she could ask any of the 100 questions suddenly crowding her mind. Sarah sat in the empty workshop, surrounded by pieces of a vehicle that had survived a war and 70 years of existence, but might not survive her attempt to restore it. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something that wasn't exhaustion or anxiety. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. She locked up the workshop and drove home through streets that were mostly empty, past houses with their lights off, past the elementary school where she'd learned to read, past the church where they'd held her father's funeral. Marion at midnight was a different city than Marion at noon. Quieter, smaller, more honest somehow. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Dishes in the sink, laundry in a pile on the chair, her bed unmade because she'd gotten up in a hurry and hadn't bothered to straighten the sheets. The cat, an orange tabby named Socket, that her father had rescued from the garage parking lot, looked at her with the particular disdain cats reserve for owners who keep irregular hours. I know, Sarah told him, filling his food bowl. I'm a terrible pet parent, but I'm trying. Socket didn't look convinced, but he ate the food anyway. Sarah showered, washing away the grease and rust and sweat of another impossible day. She stood under the hot water longer than she should have, letting it beat against her shoulders, loosening muscles that had been tight for so long she'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. When she finally climbed into bed, her phone showed 1:17 a.m. She should have been asleep hours ago, should have been taking better care of herself, should have been making different choices. But she thought about Robert Freeman driving 3 hours to teach her something she couldn't learn any other way. And she thought about her father spending a weekend helping a 26-year-old mechanic he'd never see again. And she thought about the chain of quiet kindness that connected her to people she'd never met and would never know. She fell asleep thinking about that. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't wake up at 3 a.m. with her mind racing. Robert Freeman arrived at 9:47 a.m., driving a 1967 Ford F-100 that looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and hands that were scarred in all the ways that came from a lifetime of working with metal and machinery. He wore work boots that had been resoled at least twice and a T-shirt from a restoration shop in Bloomington that had closed 15 years ago. "Sarah Brennan," he said, extending his hand. "You look like your father." They shook. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, the handshake of someone who had nothing to prove. "People tell me that," Sarah said. I've got his nose and his stubborn streak. The stubborn streak is the important part, Freeman replied. He looked past her at the jeep, his eyes moving over it with the practiced assessment of someone who could read metal the way other people read books. Let's take a look at what you've done so far. Sarah showed him the engine block, explaining the cold stitching process, walking him through her documentation, showing him the photos and measurements and decisions that had gotten her this far. Freeman examined everything in silence. He ran his fingers along the stitching, checked the torque on the pins, inspected the epoxy seal with a magnifying glass he pulled from his pocket. "This is good work," he said finally. "Better than some professionals would do. Your father taught you well. The frame, though, the frame is complicated," Freeman agreed, "but it's not impossible. Come here. I'll show you what we're working with." They spent the next hour examining the frame, Freeman pointing out stress points and structural weaknesses Sarah had identified but didn't know how to address. He explained the metallurgy of 1950s military frame construction, the specific alloys used, the heat treatment processes that made simple welding inadvisable without proper preparation. "The problem most mechanics make is treating this like modern frame repair," Freeman said. "They use modern techniques on metal that was manufactured to different specifications. The welds don't hold because the base metal can't handle the heat cycling without becoming brittle. You need to preheat, use specific filler materials, control your cooling rate." "I don't have preheating equipment," Sarah said. "I brought some," Freeman replied. "It's in my truck, along with the specialized welding rods we'll need, and the reference materials that will tell you exactly what temperature and cooling rates to use." They worked together for 6 days straight. Freeman showed Sarah how to set up the preheating equipment, how to monitor temperature with infrared thermometers, how to select the right filler material for each specific joint. They welded and ground and tested and re-welded until Sarah could execute the techniques blind, until her hands moved with the certainty that came from understanding rather than just following instructions. On the 6th day, Freeman watched her complete an entire frame section repair without guidance. She preheated the metal to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, used ER70S6 welding rod at a specific amperage and wire feed speed, controlled her cooling rate by wrapping the completed joint in insulating blankets. When she finished, Freeman tested the weld with dye penetrant, looking for cracks or weaknesses. He found nothing. "You're ready," he said. "I'm heading back to Indianapolis tomorrow. You can finish the rest yourself." Sarah set down her welding helmet. The workshop was very quiet, except for the hum of the ventilation fan and the distant sound of traffic. "Thank you," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Freeman corrected. "It would have taken longer. You would have made more mistakes, but you would have figured it out eventually. I just compressed the learning curve." He paused, cleaning his hands with a shop rag that had probably been white at some point decades ago. "Your father did the same thing for me, gave me knowledge I couldn't have acquired any other way, compressed years of trial and error into a single weekend. That's what good mechanics do for each other. We pass it on." "Did he tell you why?" Sarah asked. "Why he helped you when he didn't know you, when you couldn't pay him?" Freeman smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind that came with memories of people who were gone. He said that knowledge dies when the people who hold it die, unless they pass it on to someone who'll use it properly. Freeman replied. He said he'd learned from old-timers who'd learned from older-timers before them, and that the chain only stayed strong if every generation taught the next one. He was worried even 30 years ago that the chain was breaking, that young mechanics were being taught to replace parts instead of repair them, to rely on diagnostic computers instead of their own understanding, to treat vehicles as disposable rather than repairable. Sarah thought about her father in the final months, when the Parkinson's had progressed to the point where he could barely hold a wrench, when he'd had to dictate instructions to her instead of demonstrating techniques himself. She thought about the frustration in his eyes, the rage at being betrayed by his own body, the desperation to pass on everything he knew before time ran out. He was running out of time, she said. He knew it, even before the diagnosis. That's why he pushed so hard to teach me, why he made me work on every kind of repair, every vehicle type, every impossible problem that came through the door. He was preparing you, Freeman agreed, not just to run his business, but to carry on the kind of mechanical philosophy that's becoming rare. The idea that everything is fixable if you understand it well enough, if you're willing to try solutions that don't come from a manual, if you respect the history and engineering that went into creating it. Freeman packed his tools back into his truck, moving with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned to value his equipment. Sarah helped him load the preheating unit, coiling cables and organizing components in the truck bed. "One more thing," Freeman said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This is for you. Don't open it until after the Jeep is running." The envelope was sealed, made of heavy paper that felt expensive. Sarah's name was written on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. "What is it?" "Something your father wanted you to have," Freeman said. "He gave it to me 2 years before he died. Told me to hold on to it until I thought you were ready. I think you're ready now." He climbed into his truck before Sarah could ask more questions, before she could process what he'd just said. The F-100's engine started with a rumble that spoke of perfect maintenance and careful attention to detail. "Finish the Jeep," Freeman called through the open window, "and when you do, pass it on. That's how the chain stays strong." He drove away, leaving Sarah standing in the VFW parking lot with an envelope that felt heavier than paper should feel, holding words from a father who'd planned for his death carefully enough to leave messages behind. She didn't open it. Not yet. Freeman had said to wait until after the Jeep was running, and Sarah had learned to trust the instructions of people who knew more than she did. Instead, she went back into the workshop and looked at the frame sections laid out on the floor, broken metal that she now knew how to repair, impossible challenges that had become merely difficult, problems that had solutions even if those solutions required patience and precise execution. She had 6 weeks until Veterans Day, 6 weeks to complete the frame repairs, rebuild the transmission, reinstall the engine, wire the electrical system, fabricate or source replacement parts for 24 components, and prove that every person who'd said this couldn't be done had been wrong. Sarah pulled on her welding gloves and fired up the preheating unit. The work stretched ahead of her, enormous and detailed and absolutely necessary. She reached for the first frame section and began. Veterans Day arrived cold and clear, the kind of November morning in Indiana where the sun was bright but the air had teeth. Sarah stood in the VFW parking lot at 8:47 a.m., her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, watching Captain Morris and a dozen other veterans set up chairs for the ceremony that would begin at 11:00. The M38A1 sat behind her, covered with a canvas tarp that Morris had insisted on. "The unveiling should be ceremonial," he'd said. "These men deserve that much." Sarah had finished the restoration at 3:22 a.m. that morning, 47 days after Robert Freeman had driven back to Indianapolis, 79 days after she'd first shaken Morris's hand in this same parking lot, 7 months and 14 days after her father's funeral. The Jeep ran, not perfectly. It had a slight hesitation on cold starts that Sarah hadn't been able to completely eliminate, and the transmission shifted harder than she would have liked in first gear. But it ran. The engine turned over on the second crank, settled into a rough idle that smoothed out after 30 seconds, and held steady at temperature without smoking or leaking or displaying any of the 1,000 failure modes that had kept her awake at night for months. She'd test-driven it the previous afternoon, taking it on back roads around Marion, putting it through every scenario she could think of. The cold-stitched engine block had held at operating temperature and under load. The repaired frame sections hadn't flexed or cracked. The rebuilt transmission shifted through all 4 gears without grinding. The electrical system, completely rewired from scratch using a wiring diagram she'd found in a 1952 Army field manual that cost $60 on eBay, functioned exactly as specified. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional, reliable, restored to a condition where it could serve as a memorial rather than a monument to failure. Sarah had texted her mother at 3:30 a.m. "Jeep is finished, running. Veterans Day ceremony at 11. Linda hadn't responded. Sarah told herself her mother was asleep, that she wouldn't check her phone until morning, that the silence didn't mean what it probably meant. The envelope from Robert Freeman sat in Sarah's truck, still unopened. She'd looked at it probably 50 times over the past 6 weeks, had held it up to light, trying to see through the paper, had come close to opening it on 3 separate occasions before stopping herself. Freeman had said to wait until the Jeep was running. The Jeep was running now. But something made her want to wait until after the ceremony, until after this moment was complete. Sarah. David Sullivan approached from the VFW building, wearing his dress uniform for the first time Sarah had seen. He looked different in it. Younger somehow, despite the service ribbons that told stories Sarah didn't have clearance to hear. "Captain Morris wants to talk to you before the ceremony starts." Sarah followed Sullivan into the building, through the main hall where veterans were gathering, past photos on the wall of men in uniforms from Korea and Vietnam, and Iraq and Afghanistan. Morris stood in his office, also in dress uniform, looking at a framed photograph on his desk. "My father," he said, not looking up. "Korea, 1952. He drove supply trucks, brought ammunition and food to forward positions, sometimes under fire, sometimes at night, always in vehicles that were breaking down faster than the mechanics could fix them." Morris set the photo down and turned to face Sarah. "He told me once that the mechanics were as important as the gunners, that wars are won or lost based on logistics, on whether your vehicles can move when you need them to move. He said the best mechanics he knew could fix anything with whatever was available, didn't need perfect parts or ideal conditions." Sarah didn't know what to say, so she just listened. "I didn't think you could do it," Morris admitted. "When I made that offer in the parking lot, when I said I'd respect you if you could start the Jeep, I was being cruel. I was angry that better-funded shops had failed, angry that we'd wasted money we didn't have, angry that this vehicle my father loved was going to rot in a parking lot because nobody cared enough to save it." He moved to the window, looking out at the chairs being set up, at the tarp-covered Jeep, at the gathering crowd of veterans and family members. "I used your gender against you," Morris said. "I let you take on an impossible job for almost no money because I thought watching you fail would somehow be less painful than watching another man fail. That was wrong. I'm sorry." Sarah found her voice. "You don't need to apologize." "Yes, I do," Morris countered, "and I need to do more than apologize. This is for you." He handed her an envelope, different from the one Freeman had given her, this one simple white paper with her name written in Morris's precise handwriting. "What is this?" "Open it after the ceremony," Morris said. "But I'll tell you now. It's a check for $12,000, the amount we originally raised for the restoration, the money we'd paid to mechanics who failed. We got most of it back through small claims court and settlements. It's yours. You earned it." Sarah stared at the envelope like it might explode. "I can't take this. We agreed on $460. "We agreed on that because I was testing you, not paying you fairly," Morris said. "You've put in at least 500 hours of labor. You've used your own tools, your own expertise, your own materials in many cases. $460 was an insult, and you took it anyway because you wanted to prove something. Well, you've proved it. Take the payment you deserve." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she held the envelope. $12,000 would cover the late invoices that were piling up, would let her repair the lift in her garage that had been broken for 3 months, would give her breathing room to take on jobs based on their merit rather than their immediate cash flow. It would let her keep her father's legacy alive for a while longer. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Morris checked his watch. "Ceremony starts in 40 minutes. You should probably get yourself ready. You're doing the unveiling." "I'm doing what?" "The unveiling," Morris repeated. "You restored it. You should be the one to show these men what you've accomplished." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to say this should be Morris's moment, or Walter Chen's moment, or anyone's moment, except hers. But Morris was already walking toward the door, already moving past the conversation, like the decision was final and not worth debating. She followed him back outside, where the crowd had grown to maybe 60 people, veterans in dress uniforms, family members, local officials, a reporter from the Marion Chronicle-Tribune with a camera. Sarah recognized the mayor, a Vietnam veteran named Bill Cooper, who'd known her father, who'd spoken at the funeral about Tom Brennan's integrity and skill. Sarah found a spot near the back of the gathering, trying to be invisible, trying to let this moment belong to the people who'd actually fought in wars, rather than the mechanic who'd simply fixed a vehicle. But Walter Chen spotted her, waved her over to where he was standing with Sullivan and 3 other Korean War veterans, whose names Sarah didn't know. "You should be up front," Chen said. "You're part of this ceremony as much as any of us." "I just fixed the Jeep," Sarah protested. "You preserved history," Chen corrected. "That's not just anything." The ceremony began at exactly 11:00 a.m. Morris spoke first, his voice carrying across the parking lot without amplification, talking about service and sacrifice and the importance of remembering those who'd served. Then the mayor spoke, reading from prepared remarks about Marion's military history, about the town's commitment to honoring veterans. Then Morris called Sarah forward. "Sarah Brennan inherited more than a business from her father," he said. "She inherited a commitment to excellence, a refusal to accept the word impossible, and a respect for history that goes beyond words into action. 3 months ago, I challenged her to restore a vehicle that every other mechanic in Grant County had declared beyond repair. Today, she's going to show you what she accomplished." Sarah walked to the tarp-covered Jeep on legs that felt uncertain, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. She gripped the edge of the tarp, looking out at the gathered crowd, seeing faces she recognized and faces she didn't, seeing her mother standing at the very back of the crowd. Linda Brennan stood alone, wearing the black coat she'd worn to the funeral, her face unreadable at this distance. Sarah pulled off the tarp in one smooth motion, revealing the restored M38A1 to gasps and applause that felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. The Jeep gleamed in the November sun. Sarah had spent 12 hours yesterday polishing and detailing, removing every spot of grease, making sure every surface reflected the care that had gone into its restoration. The white Korea 1952 lettering stood out crisp and clean against the olive-drab paint. The canvas top was new, stretched tight across the frame. The windshield was crystal clear, the seats were recovered in period-correct vinyl, the gauges were cleaned and calibrated. It looked like it could have rolled off the assembly line in Toledo 71 years ago, ready for war, ready for whatever impossible tasks the army would demand of it. Captain Morris stepped forward, his hand on the driver's door. "Would you do us the honor of starting it?" Sarah climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the vinyl cool against her legs. Smelling the distinct scent of old metal and fresh paint and oil, her hands found the controls automatically. Fuel valve, choke, ignition switch. She'd started this engine probably 200 times during testing and adjustment, but this felt different, weighted with significance she couldn't quite name. She turned the key. The starter cranked twice, the engine caught, and the M38A1 rumbled to life with a sound that was perfect and imperfect and exactly right. The exhaust note was distinctive, a rough idle that smoothed after a few seconds, settling into the steady rhythm of an inline-4 engine designed to run forever under conditions that would destroy civilian vehicles. The gathered crowd was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Sarah let the engine run for 30 seconds, watching the gauges, listening for any sign of problems, finding none. Then she shut it off and climbed out, stepping back to let the veterans approach the Jeep, to let them touch it and remember whatever memories vehicles like this held for them. Walter Chen was first, his hand running along the hood, his eyes distant with something that might have been tears or might have been the November wind. Sullivan stood beside him, not touching the Jeep, but looking at it with an expression Sarah couldn't read. Other veterans came forward, some telling stories about Jeeps they'd driven or ridden in, others just standing silently, their hands on metal that represented something larger than itself. Sarah slipped away from the crowd, moving toward where her mother stood at the edge of the parking lot. Linda's expression was still unreadable, but she hadn't left, hadn't walked away. "You came," Sarah said. "Of course I came," Linda replied. "You're my daughter. You think I'd miss this? You didn't respond to my text." "I was already on my way here," Linda said. "I've been watching you work on this Jeep for months, Sarah. Watching you exhaust yourself. Watching you pour everything you had into a project that I was certain would destroy you." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I was wrong." Sarah felt something break loose in her chest, some tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I'm sorry I've been letting the business slip," Sarah said. "I'm sorry I've missed deadlines and lost customers. I'm sorry I haven't been the mechanic Dad was." "Stop," Linda interrupted. "Stop comparing yourself to him. Tom was a brilliant mechanic, but he built his business over 37 years. You've been running it for less than one. Of course you're not at his level yet. Of course you make different choices, prioritize different things." She looked at the Jeep, at the crowd of veterans surrounding it. "Your father would have been proud of what you did here, not because you proved you could match his skill, but because you chose to take on a job that mattered more than money, that preserved something worth preserving." Sarah didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. They stood together in silence, watching the ceremony continue, watching strangers become briefly connected through shared history and a vehicle that represented more than the sum of its parts. Eventually, the crowd began to disperse. Veterans shook Sarah's hand, thanked her for her work, told her stories she'd remember forever. The mayor asked if she'd be willing to be interviewed for the newspaper. Captain Morris told her the Jeep would be displayed at the VFW permanently, but that they'd need her to maintain it, to keep it running for future generations. By 2:00 p.m., Sarah was alone in the parking lot again, standing beside the Jeep, holding 2 envelopes she hadn't opened yet. She opened Freeman's first. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her father's handwriting, unsteady in places where the Parkinsons had made the pen waver, but still legible, still unmistakably his. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means Robert Freeman has judged you ready to receive it, and it means I've been gone long enough that you've had time to find your own way without my interference. I spent 37 years building Brennan's Auto Repair. I spent your entire life trying to teach you everything I knew, trying to prepare you for a career that was already changing in ways I didn't fully understand. I made you work on vehicles I could have fixed faster, made you struggle through problems I could have solved in minutes. And I know that sometimes you thought I was being cruel, or testing you, or trying to prove you couldn't measure up. That wasn't it. I was teaching you that the value of a mechanic isn't in how quickly they can solve problems or how many jobs they can complete in a day. It's in their willingness to attempt repairs that others won't touch, to preserve things that others would scrap, to see vehicles as worth saving rather than worth replacing. You're going to face challenges I never faced. Customers who doubt you because you're a woman. Shops with better equipment and larger marketing budgets. Diagnostic computers that make traditional mechanical knowledge seem obsolete. You're going to want to quit sometimes. You're going to wonder if it's worth continuing. It is. Not because of me, not because of the business I built, but because there aren't enough mechanics left who understand that their job is about more than just commerce. It's about preservation, about maintaining connections between generations, about keeping old skills alive. I don't know what you'll be working on when you read this, but I know it will be difficult. I know you'll doubt yourself. I know you'll wonder if you're worthy of carrying on what I started. You are. Not because you're my daughter, but because you care enough to try. I love you. I'm proud of you, and I'm gone, but that doesn't mean I've stopped believing in what you can accomplish. Dad Sarah read it 3 times, sitting in her truck with tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. The handwriting wavered in places where her father's hands must have been shaking, where the disease had been stealing his control. But the message was clear and certain, and exactly what she needed to hear. She opened Morris's envelope next. The check was for $12,000, exactly as he'd promised, but there was also a note. Sarah, the Marion VFW would like to hire you as our official mechanic for historical vehicle maintenance. Pay is $75 for work performed, with a retainer of $200 a month. If you're interested, call me. Morris Sarah folded both letters carefully, placing them in her glove compartment alongside registration documents and repair receipts, and the accumulated paper evidence of a life spent working on machines. She started her truck and drove back to Brennan's Auto Repair through streets she'd known her entire life. Marion looked the same as always, small, familiar, exactly as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. But something felt different, like a weight had lifted that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The garage was quiet when she arrived. Socket greeted her at the door with his usual disdain, demanding food despite having been fed that morning. Sarah filled his bowl and stood in the center of the shop, looking at the lift that needed repair, at the stack of invoices that needed payment, at the calendar showing appointments for the coming week. She had work to do. She had customers who needed her. She had a business to run and a legacy to maintain. But first, she needed sleep. Sarah locked the garage, climbed the stairs to her apartment, and fell into bed fully clothed. She was asleep before she could overthink it, before anxiety could steal her rest, before the weight of tomorrow could press down on tonight. She dreamed of her father, young and healthy, his hands steady as he demonstrated a repair technique she'd forgotten. In the dream, he didn't speak, just smiled and nodded and let her work, watching with the quiet pride of a teacher who knows his student has finally understood the lesson. When Sarah woke, it was dark outside, and Socket was asleep on her chest, purring like a small engine. She had 7 new text messages, 3 from customers confirming appointments, 1 from her mother asking if she wanted to come to dinner Sunday, 1 from Captain Morris asking when she could start maintaining the VFW's historical vehicles. 1 from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Robert Freeman, congratulating her on the completion of the Jeep and offering her referrals to other restoration jobs if she was interested. The 7th was from David Sullivan. Thank you for giving my grandfather's memory something concrete to attach to. It matters more than you know. Sarah responded to each message in turn, making appointments, accepting offers, confirming plans. The work stretched ahead of her, endless, detailed, absolutely necessary. But for the first time since her father's diagnosis, since the Parkinsons had started stealing him piece by piece. Since she'd realized she would have to carry his legacy forward alone, Sarah felt ready. Not because she'd proven herself to Captain Morris, or the veterans, or the town of Marion, because she'd proven herself to herself. She got out of bed, fed Socket again, and headed back down to the garage. There was a Buick that needed brake work, and a Honda with a mysterious electrical problem, and a dozen other jobs that required attention. Sarah pulled on her work gloves, turned on the shop lights, and got started. The work was good, the work was enough, and somewhere in the distance she could almost hear her father's voice. "That's my girl. Now let's see what you can do next."